While the iPhone 4 might seem like an ancient relic now, back in its day it was generations ahead of its time, introducing the Retina display, front-facing camera, and the first Apple Silicon chip, and at the time was the biggest leap forward since the original iPhone in 2007. And so get ready to relive the more simpler times, with no TikTok or monkey NFTs, because today I'm going to be giving my thoughts on each aspect of the 2011 iPhone 4 from a 2022 perspective, as well as how usable it is today. And by the way, if you'd like to see something specific, the timestamps are in the description below. Oh, and I'd also like to give a shout out to my friend Ashmith for generously giving me the phone featured in this video. But I do apologize, it has a bit of a flickering issue with the display, so hopefully that doesn't put you off too much and make you click away, in turn decreasing my audience retention rates and therefore causing the ultimate downfall of my channel. So starting off with the design, I think it's pretty fair to say that the iPhone 4's look is truly show-stopping, and the build quality is just fantastic. The stainless steel rails accompanied by the glass back are just so clean, and make the phone feel exceptionally solid and well built in the hand, and even 12 years later, it still feels like a premium and expensive product. And interestingly enough, the most recent iPhone 13 series utilize a suspiciously similar layout. But honestly, how can anyone not consider this to be one of the best smartphone designs of all time? The circular volume buttons, the industrial looking speaker grills, the classic home button, and the way the stainless steel rails just work so seamlessly with the glass back. Although I do hate to spoil the party, it was apparently very common at the time to see a lot of cracked iPhone 4s in public, since the glass back did make the phone a lot more fragile than the previous 3GS's plastic housing. And since wireless charging was basically unheard of back then, the glass didn't serve any purpose other than aesthetics. And so 2 generations later, it was removed and replaced with aluminium. But notably, the iPhone 8 did bring back the glass rear in 2017 when wireless charging became a bit more widespread. One other quote-unquote issue with the design worth mentioning is something that was known at the time as antenna gate, in which for some users, calls would lose connection if the phone was held a certain way, due to the user's finger covering up the poorly placed antenna band. Apple did fix this with the iPhone 4S the following year though, as well as offering free cases to those affected, but you know, it's still something that should never have happened. Now in terms of how the design has aged, well, the most prominent clue is the 30-pin charging connector. This phone was still 2 generations away from switching to the Lightning port, and so if you have one of these old iPhone 4s lying around and you want to charge it up and play around with it, then you'll need to make sure you have one of these old chargers, of which were much less convenient than the Lightning port and would only go in one way, plus they were more fragile and they charged the device more slowly. Now when it comes to feel in the hand, the iPhone 4's form factor is terrific. It's very easy to carry around, very portable, and one-handed use is an absolute breeze. It's got a weight of 137 grams and a thickness of 9.3 millimeters. So it's not the thinnest or lightest out there, but it's in that sweet spot where it's good to have that little bit of heft to make the phone feel solid. And as I said before, build quality on here is just phenomenal, and it looks great as well, so that's a win-win. Now I'm pretty stunned to say that the display on the iPhone 4 is actually the area that it holds up the best in. I mean, maybe not this specific handset, since again, it's got a bit of a flickering issue, and I once again apologize for this. But this display is very impressive, considering that most phones at the time had resolutions equivalent to vending machine displays that tell you that your selection of B24 is invalid. It is very hard to believe that this panel is from 2011, 2014 or 15 maybe, but definitely not 2011. Everything looks pretty darn razor sharp, and discerning individual pixels is pretty hard, even if you look really closely. So articles to movies to games are going to be extremely pleasant to look at. Spec-wise, it's a 3.5-inch LCD panel with a resolution of 960 by 640 and a pixel density of 326 pixels per inch. These numbers were leaps and bounds ahead of the competition, and even the previous iPhone, because it was the first to introduce the Retina display, and that's what Apple's displays are called even now. Back then, Steve Jobs described the Retina display as it being impossible to discern any individual pixels at a normal viewing distance, and this phone definitely lives up to that claim. In fact, it stood the test of time so well that the iPhone SE that just came out still uses the exact same pixel density as this phone, and so that should give you a fair idea of just how solid these specs were. Although unfortunately, the same pleasantness cannot be found in the iPhone 4's camera setup. I know I'm not going to be blowing too many minds here, but the iPhone 4's 12-year-old cameras are pretty laughable compared to what we have now. Although, to its credit, the iPhone 4 was actually the first iPhone to introduce the front-facing camera, something that a lot of us would be very hard-pressed to live without today. On the rear, there's a 5 megapixel lens with flash, and on the front, you get a whole 0.3 worth of megapixel. And while these cameras would have been top end in 2011, age has definitely taken a toll on just how primitive they seem now. Although the rear lens can do a somewhat decent job in good lighting. Anything less than that though, and your expectations should be minimized. Indoor shots are most likely going to be blurry and unusable, and if it's nighttime, you can pretty much just forget it. But again, it can take the occasional decent photo in bright outdoor lighting. However, the selfie camera, which is packed with a shocking 0.3 megapixels, is guaranteed to be horrific pretty much every time. Selfies on here are just a complete joke by 2022 standards, but again, this was the first iPhone to have a selfie camera, so I suppose I can't be too harsh. And back then, the main point of the selfie camera was to be used for FaceTime, and for that, it worked great. Moving on to video recording, the iPhone 4 can shoot in up to 720p at 30 frames per second, and just like the photos, video is still pretty bad, especially since it lacks optical image stabilization, but you know, again, in 2011, no one would have complained since it would have been the best of the best on the market at the time. Now in terms of performance, as mentioned earlier, the iPhone 4 was the first iPhone to sport an Apple manufactured chipset, the Apple A4. Plus, it also doubled the RAM from 256 megabytes on the iPhone 3GS to 512 megabytes, which was pretty significant, even if those numbers seem puny today. But you know, unfortunately, 12 years later, the iPhone 4 definitely isn't the fastest on iOS 7.1.2, but at the same time, it's not absolutely unbearable. Light activity like swiping around the interface, texting, calling, and opening stock apps isn't tedious, and based on my experience, it's actually somewhat grin and bearable. Anything more than that though, and you're going to be pushing it. And I'm talking about web browsing or navigating on Apple Maps. Again, it's not absolutely brutal, like for example, the iPhone 4S on iOS 9, but in a nutshell, it's honestly not going to be as sluggish as you might expect a phone this old to be. But like, it's still not something you'd want to use. Now on the functionality side of things, meaning what you can actually still do with this phone, well, there isn't really too much anymore. But I mean, it's not really a surprise considering that this phone is 12 years old and hasn't gotten any updates since 2013. Most apps just can't be downloaded on here anymore, due to them not being compatible with software this old, and the ones you can download either crash upon opening them, or are just a buggy, unusable mess. Outside apps though, web browsing on here is still possible, but not really practical. You can still search for things and access most websites, but there definitely will be compatibility issues, and it's a bit of a coin toss, you know, some websites won't work at all, some will work fine, and some will just kinda work. But you know, all in all, it's just not a pleasant or ideal experience. Although you can actually still make calls and text, since 3G networks aren't completely gone yet, and you can do offline things like setting alarms or reminders, using the calendar app and writing down notes, and it'll actually work well for this, but like, there's no actual reason to use it for that. Basically, the iPhone 4 just isn't fit for daily use anymore. And lastly, moving on to the battery life, well, I'll let you guess this one for yourself. If you guessed that most iPhone 4s have shot batteries and struggle to last a few hours these days, you would be right on the money. On the iPhone 4, we're looking at a 1420 mAh cell, and the time between charges is going to vary across every individual device, but in 99% of cases, it's just not going to last very long at all. But like, you know, if you're not using it as your daily driver, which I really hope that there's no one still doing, it doesn't really matter anyway. And so that pretty much concludes my review of the iPhone 4 from a 2022 perspective. This was one of the biggest leaps forward in terms of iPhone innovation, bringing tons of features that pretty much every phone still utilizes today as an essential part of the device, like the Retina display, front-facing camera, and Apple's ARM chipsets. Spoiler alert though, it doesn't really make for a good daily driver 12 years later. And so, if you're thinking of buying one, then you're heavily misguided, because besides from texting and calling, maybe a bit of light web browsing, there just isn't really anything you can still do with this phone. And even if that's all you intend to do, it's just not a phone you should be using anymore. And definitely not a phone you should be going out and buying. But let's not forget just how innovative this phone was, and how it introduced a lot of the common things that we take for granted today. Oh, plus it also looked really stunning. If you enjoyed this video, or found it useful in any way, please make sure you drop me a like and subscribe to TechSpree for more reviews, insights, and the occasional unboxing. Thank you so much for watching. This is Tom with TechSpree, and I'll see you as always next time.